Good morning, this is Emily Carver, this is Britain's Newsroom.
Now, recapping the breaking news this morning, the head of the Catholic Church, the Bishop of Rome, has died. And joining us now is Simon Caldwell, the Associate Editor of the Catholic Herald. And could we get your reaction, please, Simon, to the events this morning?
Yes, it's very sad when we lose any pope, and of course.
Hi, Simon, if you can hear us. Just the breaking news that we're hearing that Pope Francis, the Vatican has announced that he has died, sadly, aged 88. Yesterday, of course, he was out and about in his Pope-mobile, blessing hundreds of people there in Vatican City. Just your reaction as Associate Editor of the Catholic Herald.
Yes, it wasn't entirely unexpected. He'd been ill for a very, very long time, but of course, he's shown great character, which is very typical of the man himself, in wanting to work until he died. This is a man who died with his boots on, so to speak, and people have been talking about him being on death's door since January or February, sorry, when he first went into hospital. I think it was Valentine's Day. But Francis is quite a fighter, and he fought, and of course he also had the best healthcare. He had the same quality of healthcare that one would expect to see from might receive members of the royal family might receive. So that certainly helped. But he wanted to get back to work. Even when he was ill, he was working, and it doesn't really surprise me that he's died the day after possibly the busiest day of the Church's calendar, which he would have hated to have missed.
I mean, in your dedication to Pope Francis, on your website this morning, you refer to his political interventions, his statements on progressivism over his some 12 years as Pope, and people will be reflecting on that this morning, won't they?
Of course. Francis was very much a controversial figure, within the Catholic Church especially so. I wouldn't expect anybody to pour scorn or criticise him in these days of mourning. But I think once the 9 days are over, people will be looking at his legacy very, very carefully. He was a pope who was divided opinion. Lots of people, he left lots of Catholics exasperated, but then other people said would praise him for doing the little things well. Remind us, for example, of the importance of mercy and how we approach difficult issues with a very human face. So certainly he will go down in history as one of the most interesting popes. So I'm no doubt about that.
He's known as a very quite humble as a person, rejecting one papal residence for a more humble abode. Did that characterise his character, his personality as a whole, Simon?
I'm not sure whether I would describe him as a particularly humble man. We're all called to humility as Christians. We see humility as the most important virtue. It's the opposite of pride. Francis privately was an authoritarian. People have this idea that he's a kindly avuncular, humble figure, but he was an authoritarian figure. He's like a Jesuit school teacher who wanted it his way or no other way, and he could throw tantrums. He would swear. I mean, these aren't really the characteristics one would associate with humility.
No visits to Britain for Pope Francis, but we will expect a significant reaction from the British Catholic community and, of course, from its leaders.
Yes, of course. I mean, I've never met Francis personally, but I did see him a few times, and one of the things he did for me personally as a Brit was to canonise St. John Henry Newman. That was in 2019, and he's the last British Englishman to be canonised, and Francis presided at that ceremony, and that was a wonderful occasion. And I will always remember it, and I also remember that Francis is the Pope who did that.
Simon, of course, there will be a period of reflection now, but they'll also turn to the selection of the next Pope. And Pope Francis himself was an outside choice when Pope Benedict was elected in 2005.
Yes, but I think he was also hunted by people who wanted the Church to change direction. the church is like any institution, big institution. It's political, and there's all kinds of agendas at work. And there were people who were unhappy with the way St. John Paul II and Pope Benedict had interpreted the Second Vatican Council and its teachings, and they wanted it to be more attuned to what they called the spirit of Vatican II. So I think Francis was selected to enact that alternative vision. It hasn't left a very united church. Not everybody has identified with the agenda of Francis. So I think that will be reflected in the conclave. I mean, Francis has chosen many cardinals who he thinks will uphold his legacy, but they will, in the end, they're going to do what they think is right. And I would be surprised if we have a Francis II. I really would. I think the church will move more in the direction that Pope Benedict and John Paul II were taking it, but maybe not to the same extent.
Simon, I was at Westminster Cathedral yesterday for the Mass for Easter Sunday, and it was quite an overwhelming experience, a huge congregation of people from all over the world and, of course, from London and around the country. There's a feeling as though Christianity is going through some kind of revival. We've seen recent polling and about how Gen Z, the younger ones, are moving towards Christianity. Of course, Catholicism has hundreds of millions, if not billions, of followers around the world. But do you sense that too?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, as the darkness draws in, the light of truth shines ever more brightly. And what the Catholic Church does or the gospel, when it's preached properly, when it has huge power and a huge attractive power, it always has. That power we've seen throughout history for the last for 20 centuries, and that's what I think attracts young people. They see truth, they see beauty, and it talks to them very more clearly and more than the passing mores of the present age.
He was a pope of firsts in many senses, but perhaps most importantly, the first Jesuit pope. Please explain to our audience the significance of that.
Well, I mean, the Jesuits were an order that was founded in the 16th century by a Spanish nobleman called Ignatius of Loyola, and they soon became the most powerful order in the church. And the Jesuit leader was known as the Black Pope, I mean, the alternative pope. But they were always controversial. They were kicked out of South America, Spain and Portugal and all the colonies because they were active against the slave trade, for example. So, and more recently, they've been in the 1960s, 90s, well, 70s and 80s. They became quite radical on the left of if you like, of the politics of the church, and were embracing things like liberation theology and that kind of thing. So Francis is from that school, really. He's one of those the Jesuits of that era. So it's quite it's very unusual to have a Jesuit as a pope because because of the way they've been controversial down centuries. Then secondly, to have a Jesuit of that particular school in this time in history is also quite unusual. But I think, again, it's deliberate. I think people wanted him for that particular...
And Simon, we've touched on this, but he did prove controversial to some people, not afraid to ruffle some feathers, not afraid to comment on issues to do with immigration, and not afraid to comment on things like climate change, not afraid to comment on capitalism even, and the perils of inequality and exclusion when it comes to the economy. What do you make of that, Simon?
Well, I think he is very much in line with the globalist progressive agenda, which not all Catholics are. I mean, some are, lots aren't. And so sometimes people would wonder what on earth he's up to. And in Italy, for example, they rejected, the Italian Catholics just took what he was saying with a pinch of salt. They didn't, you know, the Pope, what we want from a Pope is clarity on teachings on faith and morals. We don't want political elections. And really, they shouldn't. But of course, you know, where it talks, where basic human rights are at stake, or then you would expect a pope to say things, especially about the wars and in the Middle East and Ukraine and things like the rise of euthanasia in the West. That's what you'd expect a pope to intervene.
Yes, because Simon, some people have pointed out that he only gave J.D. Vance, for example, a very short amount of time. Now, knowing that sadly he passed away today, there may have been many reasons for that, but some people pointed that it could be because they wouldn't align necessarily when it comes to politics, as you say.
Yeah, but I think it's got to deal with people, whatever the politics are. I couldn't possibly speculate on the reasons why they held such a brief meeting. Maybe it might well be because of the Pope's health. But I think if a head of state, or in this case, the second most important person in the country, or the vice president, then you've got to treat them accordingly. And it doesn't matter which country they come from, really. It's a diplomatic trip. So yeah, Francis, his politics wouldn't have been the same as every Catholic's politics, that's for certain. Yeah, some people thought he was wildly out of touch.
Well, Simon,
other people would have liked it.
There was a more significant and special meeting that the Pope had earlier this month with the King and Queen, meeting on their 20th wedding anniversary. That itself was a lengthier and possibly a happier engagement than the one he had with the US Vice President.
Yes, I'm sure it was. I don't think. Well, our monarchy, of course, is a constitutional monarchy, so they might not have been talking about the most urgent political matters of the day. It might have been more of a social thing, I think.
And we're hearing tributes from around the world. Kemi Badenoch's statement has come out, very heartfelt one, praising him as a man of service, of public service, rather than vanity or anything else. We'll be hearing from all political leaders from across the world, of course, religious people as well. In terms of how people will mark this in the Vatican City, do we know what happens on an occasion like this?
Well, like I said, there'll be 9 days of mourning, and then they'll move into the conclave, I think, after 14 days. So there'll be lots and lots of masses for the repose of the soul of Francis. But I'm hoping to get out there myself in the third week in May. But I haven't been to Rome for the previous two, so I couldn't really say exactly what it would be like. I'm going to be discovering it for myself for the first time.
Yes, J.D. Vance has posted on X that he says, "My heart goes out to the millions of Christians all over the world who loved him. I was happy to see him yesterday, though he was obviously very ill, but I'll always remember him for the below homily he gave in the very early days of COVID. It was really quite beautiful. May God rest his soul." Yes, clearly, Pope Francis's health was not in a good state for a very long time. He spent, I believe, 38 days in hospital, pneumonia, all sorts of issues. But to see him out yesterday in his Pope-mobile with huge crowds, giving his remarks and expressing joy at Easter Sunday, also talking about wars around the world and the importance of peace and everything, it will come still as quite a shock to people, Simon. And Easter Monday itself feels poignant.
Yes, yeah. I think if it's a great time. It's a great for a pope to die over Easter. I think is a source of blessing. I think Francis. You saw in his final days. I think there were times where you got the sense that he really was preparing for death. I mean, he was seen being pushed in a wheelchair to visit the tomb of Pope St. Pius X, a pope who lived about 100 years ago, who Francis admired greatly. And he was wheeled down basically in his pajamas, as if like he said, "Look, please take me," without being dressed up and everything. He was just wearing a poncho. And then he also went to pray at St. Mary Major's Basilica because he had a very, very strong devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. And so it's almost as like he was preparing. He knew it was coming. He was preparing for it. And of course, his funeral will be different as well from previous, from those of John Paul II and Benedict and other modern pontiffs in the sense that he won't be buried in the Vatican. He's going to be buried in St Mary Major's Basilica, which is dedicated to Our Lady.
Simon Caldwell, Associate Editor of the Catholic Herald, thank you so much for joining us on GB News this morning. And we're now joined by Alice Grant, political commentator, on this very sad day for Catholics around the world. Some 1.4 billion Catholics in the world, Alice. And Pope Francis was the first non-European pope for more than 1,200 years. This will be a chance to reflect on that global community, Alice.
Yes, so Pope Francis, the first South American Pope, which is, I think, one of his many, I guess, unique aspects of him and his papacy. Obviously, this day is going to be one of mourning and prayer for him across the world for Catholics.
And Alice, it was Easter Sunday yesterday, a day of reflection, but also celebration for Christians around the world, and then to be hit by this very sad news that may well have come as a shock after so many people saw him out and about yesterday, blessing hundreds of people as he went. It will come as a shock, difficult for many people around. How will people mark this?
I think one of prayer, really, and I mean, Easter Monday we're called anyway to sort of reflect on the celebration that we have just partaken together as a church, the great, magnificent celebration of Easter and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, our Lord. But I think especially today we'll be keeping Pope Francis in our prayers and praying for him, and obviously for his intercession. I believe that he will definitely, be there interceding for us before God, and really just coming together as a church. I mean, it's a very special and unique moment in the liturgical calendar. And whilst it's sad, I think that I was very shocked by the news and very saddened to hear that he'd passed. I think at the same time, we can't help but feel that this is such a miraculous time for him to have died, that it just comes literally just after the incredible celebration of Holy Week in Rome and across the world.
And Alice, as is often the case when a global figure dies, you refer back to their early years. And Pope Francis, he once worked as a nightclub bouncer and a janitor before feeling a calling to the priesthood. It was a remarkable early life and a rise to the papacy.
Absolutely. I think something that made Pope Francis so unique was the way he was just incredibly compassionate, and I think one of the only and strongest voices advocating for peace across the globe. I mean, with this war-torn world that we live in, and so many politicians who are keen on stoking more war across the world, I think Pope Francis, I felt, was a true, genuine voice for peace and for compassion and for prayer, and I think that's what made him such a holy and special man. Of course, also his Franciscan charism. He took the name Francis, which was very unique for a pope, and really St. Francis in our church is praised and loved for being someone who was incredibly humble and dedicated to service and peace-loving. So, incredible papacy.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Alice Grant. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us on this sad day for Catholics around the world. Alice Grant, their political commentator. Right, well, we are now joined by our panel today, Annunziata Rees-Mogg, who is the Head of Communications at Popular Conservatism. Thank you very much for joining us. And we have the former Labour advisor, Matthew Torbett. Thank you as well for joining us. Annunziata, of course, will speak about this news that we're all hearing today, that Pope Francis has died on Easter Monday, no less. After yesterday, the world saw him out and about, doing his duties as Pope. Quite the shock for many people.
Absolutely, and I think these people with great devotion to their duty do sometimes make that enormous extra effort to get through the big, important thing. That the Queen saw Liz Truss, for example, and the Pope made it through Easter Sunday and went out in public, which, of course, is the most important day in the Christian Church.
And Matthew, you've heard now from the Archbishop of York paying tribute to the Pope as a holy man of God, but who was also very human, and that was the particular element of his papacy that I thought brought it home for many people.
Yeah, I think this guy was the Pope that literally got the bus. You know, he didn't change his lifestyle upon becoming the papacy. He's spoke out for the things that he believed in. He had lived in a very humble abode rather than the sort of palace in the Vatican. And I think, you know, this will be a day of sadness for many people. But I think at the same time, he lived an extraordinary life and did so much with it. And to die at 88 is I think, a good age. It's, you know, I don't feel he's been taken too soon, or it's a tragedy in any case. And I think, like Annunziata said, I think the fact that he... I mean, I felt a little bit sorry for him, but it's my understanding he wanted to continue with his duties, despite being clearly not very well at all, looking a bit fed up at times, a bit tired. You know, he's going to be feeling it, obviously. And we have to remember, he's had pneumonia. He's only got one lung. He had similar disease at 21, and therefore nearly died then. So, you know, he's lived a totally extraordinary life, and it should be something that's celebrated, really.
Yeah, he was in hospital for days and days and days, 38 days, I believe, which is no small feat. Of course, the tributes are pouring in, as you'd expect. The Irish president, he's said that Pope Francis sought to play a positive role on issues such as the role of women and the LGBT+ community in the Catholic Church. He also spoke about how Francis spoke out on the scandal of child abuse, including in the church, although there has been some criticism, of course, that he didn't do enough or in enough of a timely fashion on that front. And Annunziata, it must be spoken of. He was controversial in some elements.
He certainly was, and I think in his interpretation of being Pope, there was a lot of politics, and that made it very controversial. That if you look at his stances on migrants, on the environment, they went far beyond the faith that he was in charge of, and I think that came with difficulties.
And Annunziata often struggling to give a critical line in some areas where perhaps some Catholics would have wanted him to do so. I think in particular in 2016 when Father Jacques Camel was martyred and ruined, which is a horrendous incident for the Catholic Church by Islamic extremists. They murdered him in an appalling way at the altar. And when he was asked about this, Pope Francis says, "I don't like to speak of Islamic violence. There are violent Catholics." These moments created significant controversy.
They certainly did, and I think he also did go against targets that didn't need to be gone against. For example, the Latin Mass, that not only is rising in popularity, but actually Catholic means all-encompassing. And one of the great things about the Latin Mass was that it brought the world together, that wherever you were in the world, you could go to Mass and understand what was going on. And it brought a unity to the church. And I think going against that as a target was an unusual decision to make.
Now, yesterday I was actually at Westminster Cathedral for the Easter Sunday Mass in the morning. A spectacular affair, absolutely huge congregation, people from across the world and, of course, across the United Kingdom and London. Beautiful service. I imagine churches up and down the country will be preparing for some kind of requiem mass, Annunziata. Is that what will happen?
Churches will be open for Catholics to go and pray for the soul of Pope Francis, but like you, I was at church yesterday, not in the grandeur of Westminster Cathedral, but in the church, Catholic Church in Skegness. And it was overflowing. And it has been quite remarkable that over the last few years, quite how many more Catholics are coming to Mass. And I think you can't take away from the fact that Pope Francis was the Pope during that rebirth of Catholicism in our country. Although, of course, it is growing across the rest of the world. It's only Europe that has been in decline.
Matthew, we've heard a bit about the Pope sort of intervening on issues such as climate change and immigration. Do you think people in Britain, or indeed around the world, have sort of welcomed those interventions, the religious voice in our national and international debates? We just heard that more and more people, particularly from Gen Z, are going back to church. Did he sort of have this period of intervening more and more as there's been a charted rise and people really getting back and engaging with those religious voices and experiences?
It could be. I mean, I'd not thought of it in a way like that, but I suppose the only times I've been to church is in times of desperation. It's not really something for me, but I don't know if I'd watched too many films and I thought I must go and find God and this will sort of help me. I think we're living incredibly scary times. The world is very scary for lots of people, all different generations. People do feel desperate. People probably feel worse off than they have in many years. Therefore, you turn to people you think you can trust, and faith leaders tend to offer that. And I think for him to offer, calls to be more positive for progressive politics and whatever else, I think maybe people feel like they can be part of something in that, because we live in very divided communities, not just on faith lines, on many lines. And I think people probably in this country and elsewhere are searching for something to be part of, and a community in that sense, and that's something the church probably provides.
I think you're absolutely right, and anecdotally I would say that there's a lot of people in this country who are of course culturally Christian that may feel now that they've been complacent.
Well,
and starting to go back to church is one of the ways in which they can demonstrate that they are culturally Christian.
Certainly, talking to a couple of local priests in Lincolnshire, there have been conversions and adult baptisms to the Catholic Church that they hadn't been expecting, and it's been particularly true in the last couple of years. And I think part of that is that the Church of England isn't providing the structure, the rules that make you feel safe, that actually knowing exactly where you stand on faith, on belief, on the meaning of Christianity and God himself is so important to have that grounding in very turbulent times. And I think that it is the strictures of the Catholic Church that give it an appeal that more lax organisations don't have.
But of course, Annunziata, there was a lot of fluctuation, as it were, in his own pontificate. He was a pope of firsts in many senses, the first Francis, the first Latin American pope, but also, extremely uniquely, in an extraordinary fashion, his immediate predecessor was still alive for the most of his time as pope.
Indeed, and Pope Benedict was a very different pope. It was a whole-scale change when Pope Francis was appointed. But I don't think we can take away the fact that the world does change, but it also can change back, and that we look forward by learning from the past. And that's what we must do now.
I think it's worth probably just reading out a few of the most recent political tributes coming from our politicians. The Mayor of London has said that as the mayor to a city of more than 1 million Catholics, I want to express my sadness and the sadness of Londoners at the passing of His Holiness Pope Francis. He was a man of courage and humility. We keep hearing this word humility, don't we? Who demonstrated how cooperation between faiths was a force for good. We've also heard from the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby. He's paid tribute to Pope Francis, adding that he'll miss him deeply. He says, with a deep sense of personal sadness, I mourn the death of my friend, His Holiness Pope Francis. He talks about the global church. He talks about a great sense of loss. He was a pope who spoke not just to the Catholic Church, but far beyond it. Again, that's a theme that we're hearing about interfaith relations, hearing about not just for Catholics, the Pope, but for talking to people of all denominations and none. Now, some people will criticise that. Other people will totally embrace that kind of approach, Matthew.
Yeah, I think it depends on your point of view. I think we all learn more from each other by talking to each other. I think the freedom to practice religion is an important thing. It's not really it's not really something I subscribe to, but I find it fascinating. I like to learn from people. And actually, I'm quite envious of people that have a faith. I would love to think that, people I've lost have gone to better places, or when things are going bad for me, that maybe someone is just testing me and whatever else. And I think it's also good to have potentially a moral code of something you live by, and practicing what you preach and other things. But no, I think interfaith work, particularly in a very fractured point in our lives, is of what Pope Francis did.
Matthew and Annunziata, thank you so much for joining us. Well, we can now go live to our royal correspondent, Cameron Walker, who is with us outside Westminster Cathedral. Cameron, this is a momentous day, not just for British Catholics, but those all around the world.
Yeah, it certainly is. It's a hugely sad day for more than 1 billion Catholics around the world. Charlie, Pope Francis, of course, was 88 years old, as you have been saying. He was the first Latin American pope. And he died, we understand, at 7:35 local time this morning, so just a couple of hours ago. And His Eminence Cardinal Kevin Farrell, on announcing the death of the pontiff, said he taught us to live the values of the gospel with fidelity, courage and universal love, especially in favour of the poorest and most marginalised. And here in London at Westminster Cathedral, we have heard from the Archbishop of Westminster, Cardinal Vincent Nichols, who's also paid tribute, saying a voice proclaiming the innate dignity of every human being, especially those who are poor or marginalised, is now silence. Now, of course, Pope Francis had a number of battles with his health. Even as a young man, he suffered from quite serious bouts of pneumonia, which meant that part of his lung had to be removed. But then, of course, you may remember, relatively recently, he spent more than a month in hospital in Rome, where he suffered a double bout of pneumonia, but he was discharged, and he was last seen actually less than 24 hours ago in the Vatican at St. Peter's Square for Easter Sunday. He was in a wheelchair, but he was waving and smiling to the crowds, and he did manage to say, "Dear brothers and sisters, happy Easter." But it was an aide that read out his blessing and his address. But he was strong enough to be driven around St. Peter's Square to wave to the crowds. The car even stopped a few times to allow him to bless babies who were being handed up to him. So clearly he was going to be around the, he appeared pretty comfortable with that, but clearly there was something else perhaps fundamentally going on, because he couldn't read out his blessing. We have not heard yet from Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer or indeed His Majesty the King, but we are expecting a statement from Buckingham Palace later on today. But French President Emmanuel Macron is among the first of the world leaders who've paid tribute, including calling him a man of humility on the side of the most vulnerable and most fragile. The Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, says that this news saddens us deeply. I had the privilege of enjoying his friendship. And she also goes on to say, Prime Minister Meloni, he asked the world once again for the courage to change direction, to follow a path that does not destroy but cultivates, repairs and protects. We've also heard from the Dutch Prime Minister, Dick Schoof, saying Pope Francis was in every way a man of the people. And here in the United Kingdom, the Scottish First Minister, John Swinney, appears to be the first high-profile political leader in the United Kingdom to pay tribute, saying Pope Francis was a voice of people, tolerance and reconciliation. Well, of course, the Pope's death has now been confirmed. His papal apartments have been sealed, but of course it's not the grand papal apartments of his predecessors. He chose instead to live in a far more modest, smaller apartments within the Vatican. And gone are the days, of course, where his forehead has been tapped with a hammer 3 times. It was simply a doctor and a death certificate that confirmed the pontiff's death. And now we've got a period of around 15 days of mourning before conclave begins to elect a new pope.
And Cameron, you are there outside Westminster Cathedral, which is considered the mother church of the Catholic Church in England and Wales. Yesterday there was a huge congregation there. I can see behind you that people are making their way up the steps into the church. I imagine that hundreds, thousands, even more, may well head to Westminster Cathedral and other churches around the country to pay their respects.
Yeah, I think you're right, Emily. It's certainly going to be a focal point here in the United Kingdom. I arrived probably 20 minutes or so ago, and there was, I would suggest, a steady stream of people going into the cathedral, perhaps to pay their respects. You can probably imagine the media here in the United Kingdom has also descended on this holy place of Westminster Cathedral. But I think as the news starts to spread around the country, as it has done over the last few hours, I think there will perhaps be more people here coming to pay their respects. And I think it's poignant, really, that the Pope held on until the end of Easter Sunday to pass on, because, of course, that it is the most important date in the Christian calendar, and perhaps that was his way of saying he's going to hold on until that moment. And of course, as you said, Emily, there were so many people here yesterday for the Easter Sunday services, and of course it perhaps will be a bit shocked, but it was quite a bit of a shock just quite so soon after we saw the Pope Pope Francis in St. Peter's Square in the Vatican, carrying out a blessing and a reading and waving to the crowds that he has passed away. But of course this is a a institution that dates back hundreds, if not thousands of years, and there are pretty clear protocols and customs to elect a new pope. And of course, in this period known as empty chair, that's the English translation, where we don't have a pope, there are of course people to carry out the day-to-day business of the Catholic Church. But of course, it was only, a couple of weeks ago that I was in Rome for the state visits of King Charles and Queen Camilla, where they did get the chance to meet Pope Francis inside his private apartments inside the Vatican. We were told that meeting was warm and cordial, and the King wished the Pope well with his health too.
And Cameron, that meeting between the King and Queen and Pope Francis just 12 days ago, a significant and historic moment.
Yes, it certainly was, Charlie, and of course, if you remember, it was originally going to be 2 state visits, one for the Vatican and one for Italy, but of course, because of the Pope's ailments and his ongoing health battles, that state visit was postponed. But unexpectedly, perhaps slightly in secret, the King and Queen did make a private audience, go to the Vatican for a private audience with the Pope, but it was only confirmed that morning because they simply did not know if the Pope was going to be well enough to meet them, but he clearly was. He was sat down, he was in a wheelchair, but he'd have the strength to meet their Majesties. Equally, the Pope did have the strength yesterday to carry out his blessings and and allow his aide to give a reading while he was there in St. Peter's Square waving to crowds. So he carried out his duties until the very end. And of course, 88 years old is a pretty stellar age. Most people would retire 20 years before that, wouldn't they? But of course, if you are in a position such as being the Pope, the Pontiff, then you are, it's a calling from God, and you are going to carry out your duties until the very end in most instances.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Cameron Walker. Cameron is outside Westminster Cathedral in Victoria for us. But in the studio, we're now joined by the journalist and Catholic commentator. Oh no, we're joined by the US journalist. We will be speaking to Caroline Farrow in just a moment, but the US political journalist, Laurie Laird, who joins us. Now, only yesterday, the Vice President J.D. Vance met the Pope, didn't he, Laurie? It was just a very short meeting. Some commentary around it was that the Pope only gave him that much time because perhaps there were differences of political opinion, but it may well have been simply because of his health.
Yeah, he wasn't all that well. I think, J.D. Vance had spent the previous day on Saturday, he had some communication with other people that are close to the Pope. I think he was very lucky to get that very brief meeting with the Pope. He was only in the facility yesterday for 17 minutes, but they did exchange some pleasantries. The Pope gave him some Easter eggs, a Vatican tie. But it's quite poignant, isn't it, that J.D. Vance is one of the very last people, or at least last international figures, that the Pope had any communication with. Quite remarkable.
And Laurie, we've heard that there was an exchange of opinions during their meeting, obviously coming from 2 quite separate political perspectives, the 2 world leaders. Do we have any understanding of what that exchange might have focused on, especially when we think about how often Pope Francis intervened on issues on immigration, which is a key issue in the United States.
Absolutely, and Pope Francis was quite unusual. He was quite outspoken about some of the things that are happening politically in the U.S., particularly over the past couple of months, but he was critical of Donald Trump's immigration policies back in 2017, but he really hyped up that criticism. He called the Donald Trump's policy, and J.D. Vance has been very supportive of Donald Trump's immigration policy. He called it a disgrace, which is a pretty harsh term for somebody outside of the U.S. circles to use. He said that it's robbing men and women of dignity. He wrote a letter in February to bishops across the U.S., really raising hackles, really raising his concern about this immigration policy. So we know, at least on immigration, that Vance and Pope Francis were coming from very, very different directions. And Pope Francis was, he made immigration and care for immigrants a hallmark of his papacy. And over the past couple of months, he appointed a bishop in the city of Detroit, reappointed a bishop in Washington, D.C., both of whom were very supportive of immigrant rights. So the 2 men were on different sort of wings of the Catholic Church. But I think this is a very important point going forward. The Catholic Church is not monolithic. And while Pope Francis was very, very popular in the U.S., about 80% of Catholics admired him, that does kind of obscure some of the problems, some of the fights that are going on further down in the Catholic religion.
Yes, and particularly when there's no distinction drawn necessarily between legal immigration and illegal. Many followers of the Catholic Church may have felt quite frustrated over that. But J.D. Vance did put out a recent social media statement. He says, "I just learned of the passing of Pope Francis. My heart goes out to the millions of Christians all over the world who loved him. I was happy to see him yesterday," he goes on, though he was obviously very ill, but I'll always remember him for the below homily he gave in the very early days of COVID. It was really quite beautiful, and he puts a link. It says, may God rest his soul.
And of course, Vance is in India, so he is ahead of time. Nothing from the White House yet. I would expect that we'll see something quite soon.
And Roy, we've just heard reaction from Taiwan. They have extended condolences to the Vatican, one of the few governments that recognises Taiwan as a country. We're learning more and more through the Pope's passing about how vital the Vatican is for international relations around the world.
Absolutely, and I think this is something Pope Francis was very interesting about, is that the appointments he made to the College of Cardinals, and this is the body that will choose the next Pope, was geographically much more diverse than we have seen historically, and this has very big implications for where the providence of the next Pope, and many Catholics believe the chance of seeing a Pope from Asia, a Pope from Africa, becomes much more realistic this time around. And of course, this is where the real growth of the Catholic religion is coming from. It's not coming from Europe. It's not coming from the US. It's coming from these more developing countries. And these more developing countries have a much more conservative view of Catholicism than perhaps Francis did.
That's very interesting, because I've been recently to Catholic Mass in London, and yes, the vicar, the priest, very from another country, from Southeast Asia. The congregation, Filipinos, Africans, Caribbeans, all over the world. And you can see the rise of Catholicism, but also when the British people turning towards Catholicism. There's been people who have been disappointed with the direction of the Church of England, for example. Where do you stand on the next papacy? Should it be looking to be more progressive and following the route of Pope Francis, or should they be sort of returning? We were talking about the ending of Latin Mass and the sort of dilution. Is that seen as a dilution? What do you think?
Is that not a loaded question?
I've thrown a lot at you.
Absolutely. I think one thing that I find extremely interesting is that the priests, the bishops of Pope Francis's age were more progressive than the group, the cohort that comes behind him. And many Catholic priests in the U.S., many of the younger cohort, are actually more conservative than those of Francis's era. He was 88 years old. Many of his colleagues are of that age, and these were some of the men that were driving the church forward in terms of tiptoeing toward, accepting homosexuality. Pope Francis said that he didn't. I forget his exact word on this. It's not any business of mine. He sort of tiptoed toward blessing homosexual unions. This is not going down well with other parts, with younger cohorts in the church. And again, it points to some of the disparities, some of the problems that the Catholic Church may have in uniting itself going forward.
And Laurie, we were speaking there about his meeting with J.D. Vance, obviously from a very different political perspective. But Pope Francis would have made political leaders nervous throughout his papacy because he was bold from the start. I mean, even just 2 years in 2015, he said that environmental degradation was a moral issue, the sort of language that would...
Almost political.
Absolutely. Would make even centrist or left-wing politicians nervous to meet him. They might get sort of out-progressived by the Pope.
And J.D. Vance got a little bit slapped down. Well, you remember a saying that the Catholic Church has, it's sort of, I don't remember the Latin term, it's essentially the circle of love. And J.D. Vance tried to invoke this to justify immigration policies. And basically what it means is your family is closest, then your community, then say your county, your country. And he used that to invoke having more care for people close to you than people far away who may be immigrants, and invoked Catholic theology or Catholic doctrine to justify this. And Pope Francis sort of slapped him down on that. And Vance came out and said, I'm a baby Catholic. He only converted in 2019. I don't know it all yet. And I think that was perhaps as close as we get to a climb down for J.D. Vance.
This is very interesting because Pope Francis has also been quite outspoken on capitalism, saying that if it's unchecked and promotes inequality. I mean, this is a very political, almost ideological stance, well, yeah, very much so, on the way governments should be running economies and things. Clearly, you know, wanting a more interventionist approach, a more distributional approach.
Yet he remained quite popular, and it strikes me that if an Archbishop of Canterbury were to venture into that sort of a discussion, you know, we would all be sitting here and up in arms about it. So it's interesting that Francis managed to sort of transcend a number of sort of bubblings further down in the Catholic Church.
Do you think that's just a personality thing?
Quite possibly. He managed to do it in a way that the public, the flock, didn't seem to find particularly offensive. I think one of the things that he did for Catholics, even Catholics who found him to be too progressive, is he began to draw a line under the sexual scandals. He allowed Catholics to not feel quite as ashamed as they might have a decade ago. And I think even those who found him too progressive politically did appreciate that they didn't have to sort of hide in the closet, you know, about being Catholic. That rehabilitation process has a ways to go, but he began that.
Well, Laurie Led, thank you so much for joining us on GB News this morning. And
very interesting.
We're joined now by Caroline Farrow, a journalist and Catholic commentator. Caroline, you started writing about Catholicism in 2010 on your blog, reflecting on a negative period for the Catholic Church in terms of media coverage. What is your reflection now as Pope Francis passes on how he has affected the view of the Catholic Church around the world?
My reaction is one of utter shock, actually. Shock and sadness, in that we all knew that the Pope was very unwell. And he'd had this period in hospital. And I have to admit, I was primed for his passing maybe 4 weeks ago, however long it was. I think it was at the start of Lent. And of course, commentating quite a lot, as I do, on matters pertaining to the Catholic Church, I think everyone had their obituaries ready to go. And certainly some of the treatment he was having seemed to be very invasive. And yet he rallied. And as many of your commentators have said, we saw him through the whole of Holy Week. So, and clearly he was looking very unwell. He was looking very bloated, I think, from the steroid treatment. But seeing the news this morning is a total, it's such a shock. But there is also something, I think, very beautiful about when he died on Easter Monday. And it was on Maundy Thursday, we were discussing how he was, even though he couldn't do his traditional duties of the foot washing, he was praying with the prisoners. And it shows that he was, above all, and I think this is what he will be remembered for, although there was a lot of controversy around Francis' papacy, he will be remembered as a man of great humility. And that's what we want for in our spiritual leader. You know, someone who's really just trying his hardest to lead the church, to join us spiritually to Christ. And, you know, you're right, he succeeded Pope Benedict, who actually got a very unfairly bad rap because Pope Benedict was he was a great theologian and he was a very academic man. And he was a lovely gentleman, but he didn't quite have that same pastoral touch as Francis. And yet, when Francis succeeded to the papacy, you know, he said, I want to be the Pope of surprises. I want to make a mess. And he did things like, for example, he didn't live in the papal palace. He didn't wear the red, traditionally a Pope wears red shoes from Prada. When Prada traditionally make them, and of course everyone disliked that because it was seen as Pope wearing designer gear. Of course, the red shoes were supposed to represent the walking in the bloodied footsteps of Christ. You know, this wasn't a designer fashion statement, but there were so many things that Pope Francis came in and decided to change because he wanted to be seen as a servant of the people and a servant of Christ. And we will see this as well reflected in some of his funeral rituals. So I think, he has transformed how people have seen the Catholic Church, in that, we are there, we've got our arms stretched wide open, that Christ comes to heal the sinners. Francis very famously said, I want the Catholic Church to be a field hospital. It's not a place for the perfect. It's a place for the sinners. And I think he's done a very good job in opening up the appeal of the Catholic Church, and realizing that we're not here. He was misquoted a lot, in that one of the things he said is, I don't want to be judgmental, judge not. And so I think people are looking at the Catholic Church slightly afresh, or he's helped them to look at the Church with fresher eyes, that, we are not just this institution where we're all sat there thinking we're wonderfully perfect. We're all in the Catholic Church, just as everyone is. We're all sinners. And I think Francis was good at that, good at trying to make the Church more relatable.
Well, Caroline, I can hear the emotion in your voice, and thank you for giving, paying tribute to Pope Francis on this very sad day for millions, hundreds of millions, if not billions of Catholics around the world. And I wish you a wonderful day too, even though this sad news has broken today. But Caroline Farrow, thank you very much indeed. We're going to now go to our correspondent Cameron Walker, who is still live from Westminster Cathedral. Now, Cameron, the King has now issued a statement.
Yes, he has, Emily. In the last few moments, Buckingham Palace has released a message from His Majesty the King, and I will read it out to you. He says, "My wife and I were most deeply saddened to learn of the death of Pope Francis. Our heavy hearts have been somewhat eased, however, to know that His Holiness was able to share an Easter greeting with the Church and the world he served with such devotion throughout his life and ministry. His Holiness will be remembered for his compassion, his concern for the unity of the Church, and for his tireless commitments to the common causes of all people of faith and to those of goodwill who work for the benefit of others. His belief that care for creation is an existential expression of faith in God resounded with so many across the world. Through his work and care for both people and planet, he profoundly touched the lives of so many. The Queen and I remember with particular affection our meetings with His Holiness over the years, and we were greatly moved to have been able to visit him earlier in the month. We send our most heartfelt condolences and profound sympathy to the Church he served with such resolve, and to the countless people around the world who, inspired by his life, will be mourning the devastating loss of this faithful follower of Jesus Christ." The message there from His Majesty King Charles III in the last few moments. And of course, it was just less than a month ago that the King and Queen were in Rome for that state's visit, where they made an unexpected, unannounced visit to the Vatican to visit Pope Francis one final time. This, of course, happened because the state visit to the Vatican had to be postponed because of the pontiff's health. And the King and Queen, we understand, greatly enjoyed the meeting and wished the Pope well with his health, and the Pope in turn wished the King well with his cancer treatment. Of course, King Charles is Supreme Governor of the Church of England, Pope Francis head of the Catholic Church, and it was King Henry VIII which cut ties with the Catholic Church here in the United Kingdom. But of course, as the centuries have gone on, those two churches have worked hand in hand and have extended hands of friendship to one another, and I think the King's message there is an example of just that.
It's twice as Prince of Wales. Now, the most recent visit of the King and Queen in April was the first when Charles became king, and as head also of the Catholic Church, the Church of England, as you said. And the pair are said to have had a huge respect for one another, Cameron.
I think he certainly did. As he said, visited on a number of occasions, and Queen Elizabeth II as well visited the Vatican on a number of occasions too. Of course, it is highly significant that more than 1 billion people around the world are part of the Catholic Church, and it is the Pope who is head of the Catholic Church, just as King Charles is currently head of state here in the United Kingdom and, of course, Supreme Governor of the Church of England. And it's that level, perhaps, of service shown by Pope Francis for his Christian followers in the Catholic faith, and, of course, King Charles, which perhaps ring true with one another. They certainly can perhaps talk about that. Of course, we don't know exactly what was said in that private meeting a few weeks ago. We did have a single photograph, though, taken inside the Pope's papal apartments of the King and Queen, well, the King shaking hands with the Pope, who, of course, was incredibly frail, but still well enough to carry out his duties. And I think it's quite significant as well that it is King Charles we're hearing from first, rather than Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer, because, of course, it is King Charles who is head of state here in the United Kingdom, and perhaps we will get a message from Downing Street relatively shortly.
Yes, it's just so poignant that he was there out and about yesterday in his Pope-mobile, blessing children, blessing babies, blessing the crowds, bringing huge smiles to so many people's faces. And then so sadly, tragically, the next day he passes on Easter Monday. Cameron, thank you very much indeed, Cameron Walker there outside Westminster Cathedral, the Roman Catholic Church in central London. Shall we speak to Alex Stafford now, who's the chairman of the APPG to the Holy See? Alex, now you met the Pope last April, I believe. What was that like? Alex, I don't think we have your... Alex, sorry, we just had an interruption in your audio. If you'd like to restart. How was your experience with the Pope?
Yes, so I led a delegation last April of parliamentarians cross-party to meet His Holiness. We discussed a range of issues with him and his advisors when it comes to things like the year of the Jubilee, which is a big year for Catholics this year, forgiveness, and also political issues such as assisted dying. He was in good spirits then, and obviously today is a great sadness and shock for all of us.
And Alex, it's approaching 7 a.m. in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, where, of course, he was a bishop and as a cardinal, Pope Francis, sort of raised in Argentina. This is, of course, a moment of global reaction for the 1.4 billion Catholics all around the world.
Yes, it's a huge sadness. Obviously, the Catholic faith is the single biggest faith across the world. He is the leader, the spiritual head, and so many billions look to him for guidance on all matters, not just on matters of Catholic faith, but also of how to live our lives, of holiness, of how to be better people. And I think Pope Francis really got to grips with some of those issues, especially when it came to issues such as poverty and the environment. And for many people, he really was a break from the past of the Catholic Church when it came to these issues, such as the environment, and really engaged and spoke to so many people. The way he lived his life as Pope, relatively humbly, moving out of some of the more luxurious apartments of the Vatican, really spoke to some of the most impoverished people across the globe. And today's passing, today's news, will bring many tears to many eyes of people who look to the Pope to actually have how to live their lives and how to embrace the Catholic teaching.
So, Alex, you don't believe that he delved too far into the political, because that's been one criticism, hasn't it? You know, whether it's on immigration matters or climate change or the state of capitalism around the world. You don't believe that he could have treaded more delicately? What do you think, Alex?
Well, I think you've got to also acknowledge he's not just a spiritual leader, he's also a temporal leader as well. He is the head of the Vatican City, which is, by its very nation, a city-state. And also the popes in the past have controlled huge amounts of territory as well. So he's also a politician by his very nature. But what he is specially remembered for and can use his influence for the 1.4 billion people across the globe is to lead people in example of how to live his life. And I don't think he just said things, he actually led by example. The fact he moved out of the most luxurious parts of Vatican, even when he was first elected as Pope, he took the bus to the Vatican and paid his hotel bill. Not the Pope bill when he first elected, he literally took the bus. And people liked that symbolic side of him, so that he is, although obviously in charge of a very powerful and rich church, he actually understands the roots of Christianity, the roots of Catholicism, which is from the most humblest beginnings. And as a Jesuit, the Pope was a Jesuit, they understand how they actually need to embrace poverty, the poorest people. And when he was growing up in Argentina, Argentina, especially back then, had huge levels of poverty. He really embraced and kept talking to people who didn't have a voice. I mean, ever since the Gaza conflict, the last couple of years, he was constantly ringing the hospitals in Gaza, speaking to people out there. He really wanted to give a voice for the voiceless. And I think for that, he really did achieve that.
And Alex, obviously the tributes are pouring in to Pope Francis, but also the Catholic community around the world will start that immediate speculation on who among those red-robed cardinals will succeed him. And there'll be questions, won't there, Alex, about whether or not Pope Francis has permanently changed the nature of the Catholic Church, its intervention in politics, its intervention more into these ongoing global issues. Do you think that this election process is going to be more political, perhaps, than it was before?
I think I've been in Parliament, obviously, for years, but I think the most political body you can ever come across is the Vatican and the Papal Curia. This is an organisation that, frankly, is vying for power over 1.4 billion people of hugely influential consequence, and that will be a highly political conclave, especially between the more liberal reformers, but also the more social conservatives in the group as well. Big issues such as having the UK on assisted dying, in other parts of the world on abortion, they are going to be coming into this. But also, as you said, the roles of what's happening to the refugee crisis. The Pope Francis was very big on talking about the refugee crisis. This is going to be an issue that no side, whether you're liberal or conservative, can ignore, and will need to provide answers to the cardinals in the conclave. So what are they going to do about it and make those deals? I think the days of the Pope shut off in Rome without speaking to anyone are long gone. I think all sides want a highly politicized Pope to lead people. People are looking for that leadership. The big question is, where does that leadership take people, take the Catholic Church? And that is where it's going to get very tense.
Absolutely. Alex Stafford, thank you very much indeed for your time on this day. Chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Group to the Holy See. Thank you very much indeed. Well, we're joined in the studio now by our political correspondent, Catherine Forster, because we've received a statement from Number 10, I believe.
Yes, in the last few minutes, a statement from the Prime Minister. I'm just going to read it out. He said, "I join millions around the world in grieving the death of His Holiness Pope Francis. His leadership in a complex and challenging time for the world and the Church was courageous, yet always came from a place of deep humility. Pope Francis was a pope for the poor, the downtrodden and the forgotten. He was close to the realities of human fragility, meeting Christians around the world facing war, famine, persecution and poverty. Yet he never lost hope of a better world. That hope was at the heart of his papacy. His determination to visibly live out his faith inspired people across the world to see afresh the Church's teachings of mercy and charity. With his death, we are reminded once more of his call to care for one another across different faiths, backgrounds, nations and beliefs. My thoughts are with Catholics across the world and the Roman Catholic Church. May His Holiness rest in peace."
And Catherine, it's a moving tribute, as you'd expect. The whole world has sadly expected this would come after that 38-day in hospital, but perhaps a shock after him being present and delivering that traditional Easter address yesterday from the balcony. But in many senses, there's a lot of political controversy occurring in Britain at the moment, and the ability to put the news agenda to a pause and reflect more on Pope Francis rather than internal squabbling in Labour could come actually as a relief to Sir Keir Starmer right now.
Yes, exactly. And I think it's quite a poignant statement, isn't it? Describing him as close to the realities of human fragility. But as you say, Charlie, talking about his leadership in a complex and challenging time for the world. And that's a theme that's also been picked up today by Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the opposition. She has said that he spent his final Easter yesterday bearing witness to the faith he devoted his life to, a quiet presence at a time when the world needed humility, courage and conviction. She goes on to say his death on Easter Monday feels especially poignant. He reminded us that leadership isn't about power, but about service. Quite something, that line, isn't it? Leadership isn't about power, but about service. And the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Ed Davey, has described this as a profound loss to millions across the world. And he's also said we should remember his example, stand up for what's right, care for others, and hold on to compassion and hope. So very appropriate on Easter Monday, but how extraordinary that only yesterday we saw him on the balcony, and only yesterday he was meeting the US Vice President, J.D. Vance.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? Yesterday, a day of celebration. Today, traditionally, a day of reflection. And it is the day that Pope Francis passes. Keir Starmer mentioning again how he cared for one another across different faiths, backgrounds, this interfaith message that a number of our politicians have spoken about, and others in their tribute, about bringing people of different religions together rather than dividing. Of course, it's one thing to say that, and then for it to actually happen in all quarters. But it is something that people are talking about specifically with Pope Francis.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I think he was quite a modern pope in many ways, and also quite outspoken, because we know that he has made his views clear of some of what's been happening in America. He wrote an open letter to American bishops back in February, urging Catholics there to stand against the sort of anti-immigration narratives. We know that yesterday, although his meeting with the Vice President, J.D. Vance, was very, very brief, his officials met with the US Vice President. There was, we're told, an exchange of opinions, including on, quote, difficult humanitarian situations, with particular attention to migrants, refugees and prisoners. So obviously the US has been taking an incredibly hard line on migration since Donald Trump has come to power, and that was something that the late Pope obviously did have issues with.
It must have been very difficult for J.D. Vance to hear that coming from the head of the Catholic Church, to hear that essentially the Pope does not approve of your immigration policies and thinks they're far too callous. I wonder if J.D. Vance bothered with any pushback there, or just let it be. People are allowed to disagree.
Well, I mean, he became a Catholic 6 years ago, so J.D. Vance is, a practising Catholic, and, he said his heart goes out to the millions of Christians all over the world who loved him. He said, I was happy to see him yesterday. He was obviously very ill. And he said that when he spoke to him, he said, I pray for you every day. The Pope's aides apparently gave J.D. Vance some Easter eggs to give to his young children. But yes, you can only imagine behind the scenes. I think it sounds like quite differing views were exchanged.
Very tense when two worldviews collide like that from two very important people.
And we're hearing more of this British political reaction. Catherine, Sir Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, has praised the Pope for his compassion and courage. He said that the Pope's passing is a profound loss to millions across the world. Sir Ed Davey says that he was a leader of compassion and courage, speaking up for those in need and calling for peace in a world too often divided. And we've also heard from Nigel Farage, leader of Reform UK, saying that his sympathies go out to all in the Catholic Church following the Pope's death. We're going to continue to see this political reaction, aren't we, Catherine, because of how significant a figure Pope Francis was to 1.4 billion people around the world.
Yes, I mean, an enormous figure globally that, around the world, this means so much to so many people, and a voice for morality, looking after the downtrodden, looking after the poor, the marginalised. And at a time where the world does feel very divided, very uncertain, a lot of change, a lot of division. Yeah, so appropriate, really, that this should be on Easter Monday. And
absolutely, and we have been watching live pictures from Vatican City. As you can see, there are, if you're listening on radio, you can see there are quite a lot of people out, perhaps paying tribute, perhaps marking the occasion. It's a beautiful sunny day there in the Vatican City. Thank you, Catherine Forster, there, our political correspondent. We're going to now speak to the editor-in-chief at the Catholic Herald, Sir Eneth James. Thank you very much for joining us on this day. I imagine your readership have been quite shocked by this news. After yesterday, we saw the Pope, of course, not in the best of health, but out there, his duties, his blessings, his message, as strong as ever.
Well, good morning. Thank you for having me. Yes, well, a sad day. I mean, I would say I don't think anyone's really been shocked at all. I mean, the man who appeared on the balcony yesterday to give the Urbi et Orbi blessing was clearly a man with very little time left to live. I think the most remarkable thing has been that since his illness, he has soldiered on through many health crises in the last couple of months. And most remarkably, have made it to Easter Day to do, the last important duty of his pontificate, to give the Easter blessing from the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica. I mean, that is a remarkable piece of drama, if you like, which I think will go down in the history books. He will be remembered as the Pope whose last act it was to bless the world and the city and the world on Easter Day, before then dying in the night. It's a remarkable occurrence, but I don't think it'll have been a shock to anyone who's been paying close attention over the last few weeks, I'm afraid, because obviously Pope Francis has been sinking very visibly in the full glare of the world's media.
Sir Eneth, you've written in the Catholic Herald today, more informal than monarchical, Francis was not legalistic, referring to many of his off-the-cuff interventions in political issues. Do you think that tradition he set over the last 12 years will continue in the future of the papacy?
It rather depends. I mean, the remarkable thing about Pope Francis was that he has been the first pope really to embrace the internet in a way that the internet is now being used. His predecessor, Pope Benedict, was on Twitter, but that was not his style. He's very much been a soundbite pope. Now, whether you think that's going to continue, it has not been universally appreciated, I don't think, in many quarters of the church. Off-the-cuff remarks can be slightly problematic. There was a phase a few years ago where Pope Francis was in the business of giving off-the-cuff remarks during his morning homilies, and very often some poor Monsignor would have to be wheeled out shortly afterwards to clarify what the Pope had in fact meant. So the informality has been refreshing, certainly. It's been very endearing. It's had its complications here and there because sometimes there has been a need for clarification afterwards. But the question to that now rests with the cardinals, because they will have to choose who they want to succeed, and that style will probably be something that they take into account in their selection of a candidate.
Yes, and your readership, how have they reacted? You say it, of course, didn't come as a shock because of his poor ill health and his old age, but it will still be a very poignant day, particularly on Easter Monday, coming after the celebrations, coming after Easter Mass yesterday, that hundreds of millions will have partaken in and gone along to, and it will feel like a very poignant timing, won't it, Sir Eneth?
It will, but it will also, and the important thing to remember is that every day of this week has the character of Easter Day. We're in what's called the Easter octave. And so the message of yesterday continues all through the week and beyond into Eastertide. And so in many ways, it is a time of great blessing to die during the Easter octave, particularly in having discharged his final duty yesterday. And so to answer your question, I think our readers are reacting with the obvious sadness and grief and prayer, but also I think probably reflecting that actually if there's a time to go, and there is, and we all have one, really the Easter octave is a very beautiful time to take one's leave, and that actually they will be regarding this, I'm sure, in some ways as a blessing in its timing because of the significance of this week. And then I think as time goes on, once the mourning period is over, they will then be reflecting on who might come next and the legacy of this papacy and what it might mean for the next one.
Sir Enith James, the editor-in-chief at the Catholic Herald, thank you so much for joining us on GB News this morning.
Thank you.
We can cross live now to Westminster Cathedral to join our correspondent Cameron Walker. And Cameron, what can we expect to happen now in the Vatican?
Well, Charlie, of course, there is currently no Pope, so there are people there who carry out the day-to-day running of the Catholic Church. It's known as empty chair. That is a translation in English for 15-day mourning periods before conclave begins to elect a new Pope. Pope Francis, of course, has already detailed what he wanted his funeral arrangements to be, and it's certainly not perhaps what you'd expect from previous custom from other popes. For example, he doesn't want to be buried in a lead-lined coffin. He wants it to be simple. He doesn't want to be buried in St. Peter in the Basilica in the Vatican. He wants to be buried in a separate church as well. So there's all these different changes we are expecting with Pope Francis's health. Here in the United Kingdom, of course, I'm outside Westminster Cathedral, which we're expecting to become a bit of a focal point here in the United Kingdom for Catholics here to pay their respects to Pope Francis. Of course, in the last half an hour or so, we have had a message from His Majesty the King paying tribute. We've also had some more details from Buckingham Palace regarding the arrangements too. So, for example, the Union flags are currently being lowered to half-mast above all royal residences, apart from the one, of course, which the King is currently residing in, because the Royal Standard never flies at half-mast. The King's also ordered that sombre music is going to be played at today's guard change, and we are expecting a member at least of the royal family to attend the Pope's funeral, whenever that may be, in 10 days' time or so. Buckingham Palace not currently going into further details as to which member of the royal family that will be, but of course this does reflect the significance of the passing of Pope Francis. Of course, he was head of the Catholic Church, which has a flock of more than 1 billion people, so it is a very significant day. Of course, we saw him just yesterday with crowds at the Easter Sunday services. A blessing was delivered on his behalf by an aide, but he sat there and watched and waved. He was driven in his Pope-mobile to greet the crowds. The Pope-mobile stops on a few occasions so he could bless, the Pontiff could bless a number of babies too. And then, of course, less than 24 hours later, he passed away at 7:35 this morning local time. He had clearly significant issues with his health. He was a young man, of course, only 21 when he had part of his lung removed due to a pretty bad reaction to pneumonia, and then he spent more than a month in hospital suffering double pneumonia earlier on this year. But he was discharged. He managed to meet the King and Queen for a private meeting when they were in Rome just a couple of weeks ago. He also met the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, just 48 hours ago or something like that. So he clearly was carrying out duties until the end.
Yes, Cameron, I mean, looking back at how much he's been doing over the last however many weeks, you talk about the meeting with our King and Queen, of course. It is quite amazing, really, to think about how much he was doing right up until the end. Yesterday, as you say, blessing huge numbers of people in the crowds, delivering a message to those celebrating Easter Sunday, to Catholics around the world, another poignant message from the Pope, and then only for him to pass the following day.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, I mean, just speaking to people here, Catholic members of the congregation who've come here to pay their respects in Westminster Hall, one of which was from Argentina. And of course, Pope Francis was the first Latin American Pope in history. So it was pretty poignant for that particular lady, and she was talking to us about just, you know, kind of how sad she was. And of course, we will put that interview on gbnews.com for you. And we have spoken to a number of other people who have come here to pay their respects too. And we are, you know, as we've been here an hour or so, there has been a bit of a steady stream of worshippers who've come into the church. As you said earlier, Emily, this place behind me, the Westminster Cathedral, was packed. weeks for the Easter Sunday commemorations, and I'm sure many churches around the world are feeling a similar impact to Pope Francis's death. And of course in the Vatican itself, I'm not sure if you're playing live pictures at the moment, but the crowds are really starting to pack in St. Peter's Square there, where just less than 24 hours ago, I should say, Pope Francis was travelling around in his Pope-mobile greeting the crowd. So I think although we knew, of course, he was ill and we knew he had an ailing health, it is a bit of a shock that it is so soon after his last public appearance that he has indeed passed away at the age of 88.
Karen Walker, outside Westminster Cathedral, thank you very much. Well, we're joined now by the founder and editor of Inside the Vatican magazine, Robert Moynihan. And Robert, we're reading more of the political reactions we're hearing from around the world. And we've just heard this from the president of the Philippines, Bongbong Marcos, who says, "I love this Pope, the best Pope in my lifetime, as far as I'm concerned." We're going to have a lot more of that outpouring of emotion today, aren't we?
Well, I think so. There's a range of popes. Some are more interested in the doctrines and the rituals of the church. This pope broke that mold, and he went out to speak to the poor in a way no pope has before. He washed the feet of prisoners during the Holy Thursday washing of the feet ceremony. Some of the more traditional believers felt he'd gone too far. But around the world, people were astonished by how much he reached out to the weak, the poor, the sinful, and tried to bring them back into the embrace of the church.
And Robert, you are the founder and editor of the Inside the Vatican magazine. I'm very interested to know about your readership. Which areas of the world have been growing in interest when it comes to the Pope and the Catholic Church? Where is the Catholic Church growing?
Well, my magazine has readership in every English-speaking country, particularly the United States of America, because I'm an American. But the Catholic Church is growing, particularly in Africa. In Africa, the faith is growing so that some seminaries have 700 seminarians. Well, places like Dublin, Ireland, and New York City have a dozen or less. So Nigeria, for example, and Ghana. And I should say I've been the guest of Pope Francis. I wrote a book about him. I've been in his home, Domus Santa Marta. So I feel a certain deep sadness personally at his loss. And I was stunned this morning. The Vatican announced they would give a message at about 10:30, and then about 10:45, they announced he had passed away at 7:35. And I had seen him on Easter Eve, on the Easter Vigil Mass. He had come into St. Peter's Basilica unexpectedly before the Mass, and he walked right by me and some others who were with me, and he seemed alert. And so he again went into St. Peter's Square on Easter Sunday, and he was there for more than half an hour. And he seemed alert, as if during these last weeks he had recovered a bit from his illness. So I was stunned by the news this morning that he had passed away.
And Robert, that news is clearly stunning people who are heading into work or just waking up in Argentina. Of course, he was born in Buenos Aires, Pope Francis, to Italian immigrant parents. And when we speak so much as we have this morning about the political clashes and the bold and strident stances that Pope Francis took, the thought of President Javier Milei comes to mind regularly, of course, being the Argentinian president who regularly clashed with him, although they patched things up once President Milei reached office. He said this morning that it is with profound sorrow that I have learnt the sad news that Pope Francis has passed away. Many people who were his political opponents now coming out to praise him.
Yeah, absolutely. He's a man who received a lot of criticism from more conservative people, but among the poor of the world, people felt he really had embraced them and was trying to do something to help them. And he lived simply, and he really urged people to find ways to include people who were otherwise marginalized. This will be his legacy.
And Robert, as you can imagine, there are many people out in St. Peter's Square. The bells are ringing. There's a crowd of of many people there. Of course, a feeling of sadness, But when you look back now, I know it hasn't been very long that you've learnt this news, but when you look back on his legacy, what do you think he'll be remembered for? Lots of people saying humility, lots of people saying inclusiveness, lots of people talking about interfaith relations too. How will you remember him?
Well, I think all those things, inclusiveness and interfaith relations. He met with the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church in Cuba in 2016, the first Pope and Patriarch in history to meet. He was hoping to resolve the great division of 1054, which is the great schism between the Orthodox and the Catholics. He was working very hard. One of the steps toward that was to give Easter a common date, because in the East they celebrated according to the old calendar, a different date. So the Pope wanted Christians to reunite and to work together to do more for the poor in this world. And that, I think, will be the legacy that I remember. He was a very courageous man in struggling to urge people to follow the deepest principles of human caring for one another, human love for one's neighbor.
And Robert, he visited over 60 countries while Pope, and while meeting world leaders, of course, hundreds of times, he was never more at ease than in the company of the poor or those who are suffering. And that really reflects the significance of the fact that he chose the saint name St. Francis of Assisi when becoming Pope. We haven't spoken about that much this morning, which surprised me. Tell us more about St. Francis of Assisi and the significance of him selecting the name Francis.
Yeah. Well, I was in Assisi just last week, and St. Francis was born in 1182, died in 1226. It was sort of the beginning of the rise of Europe after the darkest Middle Ages. And St. Francis created an order of men who were committed to poverty, chastity, obedience, and they were opposed to the kind of noble and aristocratic fashions in the church at the time. They were actually countercultural in that way. And Francis' love of poverty, it was the phrase was the naked following the naked Christ, and Christ was stripped of his garments when he was put on the cross. And it's a way of setting aside all the pomp and circumstance of this world and realizing that caring for children, caring for the old people, caring for the sick, this is the essence of love for one another. All of us fall short at times, and all of us need that love. And society can become very harsh and very unloving towards people who are a little bit poorer and weaker. It can be considered their own fault, that type of thing. And Pope said, no, we must include them and love them. And that Francis movement that started in the early 1200s, next year will be the 800th anniversary of the death of St. Francis. That movement reached a new pinnacle when the Pope chose that name for the first time in church history.
OK, well, Robert Moynihan, thank you very much indeed for joining us today, founder and editor of the Inside the Vatican magazine. Now, we are going to bring you some of the reaction from around the world. Yes, the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has released the following statement. Deeply saddened to hear of the death of His Holiness Pope Francis. His tireless efforts to promote a world that is fairer for all will leave a lasting legacy. On behalf of the people of the United Kingdom, I share my sincerest condolences to the whole Catholic Church.
And we've also heard from the Russian President Vladimir Putin. He sent his condolences, says, please accept my sincere condolences on the passing of His Holiness Pope Francis. Throughout the years of his pontificate, he actively promoted the development of dialogue between the Russian Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches, as well as constructive cooperation between Russia and the Holy See in this sad hour. I would like to convey to you and the entire Catholic clergy my words of sympathy and support.
And we've also heard from the Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, who's released this statement. She says, I am so saddened to hear of the passing of His Holiness Pope Francis. It was an honour to meet him just months ago. A great leader who will be remembered for addressing the global challenges of our time and building bridges of dialogue among faiths.
And also US Vice President J.D. Vance, who's met with the Pope just last week, said, "I just learned of the passing of Pope Francis. My heart goes out to the millions of Christians all over the world who loved him."
And we have the Reform UK leader, Nigel Farage. He says, "My sympathies go out to all in the Catholic Church following the death of Pope Francis. I met him and liked him very much."
Well, we're in the panel now with Annunciata Rees-Mogg, the head of communications at Popular Conservatism, and former Labour advisor Matthew Talbot. Annunciata, I just want to start with you. We heard there from Robert Moynihan, that editor of Inside the Vatican magazine, speaking about St Francis of Assisi. Now, I understand you've been to Assisi. You know how important that church is in central Italy.
Absolutely.
And the significance of Pope Francis choosing that place and that saint for his name.
And I think many of your viewers will be familiar with the prayer of St Francis of Assisi, "Make me a channel of your peace," that he was an emblem within the Catholic Church, fighting for peace, equality, living with your fellow man, respecting your fellow man. And I think Pope Francis did try to embody that. And one of the incredibly important things that, yes, I've got my criticisms of Pope Francis's political stances, but he did bring to mind constantly mercy, compassion, forgiveness, which, after all, are what the British Constitution are based on, these Christian values of justice and liberty, of personal rights and responsibilities. And that has brought to the whole of the West that those Christian fundamental beliefs from the New Testament, and so embodied by Pope Francis, the whole Western civilization as we know it.
Yes, because our previous guest, Matthew, commented on how Pope Francis will be remembered for his stances when it came to poverty and looking after people and respecting people, whatever their circumstances. Now, I do believe that that is what most people would subscribe to. But it's difficult when it goes into the political, because people have very different ideological visions of how you achieve that. And Pope Francis took quite an anti-capitalist view, which may be one of the reasons why some of our left-wing politicians seem to be talking about this sort of inequality and all of that when it comes to Pope Francis and his legacy. So while it seems like a message that everyone can buy into, it depends on the medicine you want to prescribe.
Absolutely, and that's why I always thought he was an all right fella, because I think it would be uncontroversial to describe his politics as fairly liberal. I do think a lot of our leaders, regardless of political ideologies, could learn a lot from the legacy of Pope Francis, though, because I think in a time where I think greed and selfishness run quite rampant through certainly this country and other countries around the world, and where sowing division seems to be the sort of dish of the day, he led with acceptance, of tolerance, with love. I think he led with love, and actually particularly with the LGBT community, also led with a lack of judgment. There was obviously controversies around still upholding the idea of not having gay priests, but with regards to individuals, he said, well, it's not my place to judge. I think it's all the world isn't black and white, but I think we could all be a lot happier and learn a lot more.
Matthew, he spoke about how an economy of exclusion and inequality can kill. Now, some people would say inequality is something that is the price of freedom, that there will always be inequality within an economy unless you want to have, complete state control and equality of outcome and all of that. These are very contested beliefs that he's put out there. But somehow, because of his personality or because of his humility and because of his leadership when it comes to faith, most people accepted that, didn't have a problem with that type of message, even though on the face of it, it does appear pretty political.
Totally political, and maybe he was Comrade Francis. He's one of mine. But I think.
Well, statements like that suggest, don't they?
I'm a big believer in seeing what people do. We can all say warm words. We can all say nice things. he acted as he led,
Yes.
it seems to me, and therefore I think that's why people believed in what he was saying. You know, we have these pastors that are on millions of pounds and, you know, they promote the idea of fairness and equality and they're flying around in private jets and whatever else. He didn't do that, and I think that's the moral of the
But I think also, crucially, as Catholics, we do actually have a division of church and state, effectively. And he was entirely able to have those very strong political views without it being the teaching of the church. And people often misunderstand the infallibility of the Pope, where famously you cannot criticise. That's only over faith matters, when it's an encyclical, when it's official. But he can have any political views, and the next one will be able to hold any political views they like without that dictating to Catholics across the world what they must believe.
And Annunziata, we're talking about the significance of St. Francis of Assisi, the reference you took, and you mentioned that prayer. I think most people, when they think of St. Francis' prayer, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace, they'll think about Margaret Thatcher entering Downing Street in 1979 when she said she was going to quote a prayer. I think very few people expected her to start quoting from St. Francis of Assisi, saying, where there is darkness, light, where there is sadness, joy. These are words that Pope Francis heard as a young son of Italian immigrants in Buenos Aires that made him possibly more socialist-minded. But when Margaret Thatcher heard them, using them to channel a different perspective, it shows that perhaps while we're talking about this progressive ideology that Pope Francis had, this is, as you say, a faith for all, regardless of their politics.
Absolutely. It is an all-encompassing faith, and it is that ability to interpret as you feel means the most to you that is so crucial to its existence and survival for 2,000 years. After all, the Pope is the oldest official position still existing in the world. And that is quite an incredible achievement to have come since the Romans for the same head of a body to be progressed. It's really quite amazing, and there is that ability to interpret and be flexible that is crucial to that, but within the rigours of faith.
Well, we're going to bring in another guest for a moment. Thank you very much indeed, Annunziata and Matthew Torbett. Please stay where you are. We'll come back to you. But we're going to speak to the Catholic journalist, Portia Berry-Kilby, who's on the line for us. Portia, a very sad day for followers of the Catholic Church and for many others. The tributes are pouring in from all quarters. Your reaction?
I think it certainly is sad, but whenever a Pope dies, I think Catholics are called to prayer. They're called to pray for the repose of the Holy Father and pray for what comes next. In between 2 and 3 weeks' time, there will be a new Pope elected, and he will, I'm sure, chart a different chapter for the Catholic Church, much like Pope Francis has, that each Pope leaves their own legacy. And I'd imagine Catholics around the world are praying for not only Pope Francis, but also for the next successor of St. Peter.
Portia, I think you're still on the line for us. Sorry, we just cut out for a moment. Portia, how, as a Catholic yourself, will you be going to a special mass? Will you be marking your respects to the Pope Francis? And what might you wish for the next papacy?
Certainly. I'm not too sure when the nearest Requiem Mass will be to me for the Pope, but as soon as I do know, I will endeavour to attend that. I prayed for the Pope's repose of his soul this morning, and will continue to do so over the next days, if not weeks. And I think for the next Pope, I hope I'm a relatively young Catholic. I'm fairly conservative in my views, and I do pray that the next Pope is someone who respects that and who certainly champions the access to the old rite, and which I think draws a lot of young people to the faith. And I would pray that that is something that can be seen under the next pontificate.
One of our viewers, Maureen Wood, has just asked us to remind everyone that St. Francis is the patron saint of animals. And how important is the selection of these saint names when popes take their official names, and how much of their experience and their teachings do they try and bring into the church?
I think it's certainly important. With Pope Francis, he picked Pope Francis, and I think it says a lot when he is the first Pope Francis. If someone picks John Paul or Benedict, for instance, one would expect that Pope to continue their legacies in some way. So all eyes will be not only on who is the next Pope, but also on what name that person selects as their title.
And Portia, I imagine many people will be thinking about travelling to the Vatican, travelling to Vatican City. We're currently looking at live pictures there, an absolutely beautiful day, throngs of people there, many of whom will likely be there too to pay their respects. Portia, have you been to the Vatican?
I have. I went a few years ago and it was absolutely remarkable. But I think what's especially poignant about this year and the Pope dying in 2025 is that 2025 is a Jubilee year. So all Catholics are, as far as they are able, encouraged to attend, to visit the Vatican and to go to Mass there and to pray there. So there's even more kind of impetus this time round to go pay your respects and just soak up the beauty and the history of the Eternal City and all that it has to offer there.
And Portia, he was an outspoken Pope to the end. I mean, even as his health started to fail, he continued to engage on the big issues that had defined his papacy, in particular immigration. He had denounced US President Donald Trump and his plans for the mass deportation of migrants, with a warning that this was going to end badly. And we've been speaking about this all morning, but do you expect that Pope Francis has perhaps even permanently changed the political nature of the papacy, making it even more outspoken on even more issues?
I think it's maybe we should maybe be careful at generalising from one out of over 200 popes as to what might come next. I think increasingly people who have faith, they might seem to fall into one of two political camps. Pope Francis certainly wasn't shy about his political views and the emphasis that he gave. He was clear he wanted to emphasize certain social teachings like welcoming refugees and migrants and shying away from things like hardline teachings of abortion, because he claimed people already knew that. I think there's scope for the next pope to actually push back against that and say, the truth is the truth and it should be proclaimed no matter how liberal or conservative it might be perceived, and there's benefit in having some form of balance. But at the same time, it certainly isn't a bad thing for people to be reminded of mercy, of remembering the outcast and the persecuted, and actually thinking of those less fortunate than ourselves. That is a Catholic message. I think sometimes people feel alienated when they think the Pope is only focusing on those issues and then shying away from objective truth that we profess about marriage, about abortion, about life and death issues. So it's a tricky line to tread, but there's a lot of benefits in emphasising certain teachings of the Church, as long as it's not to the exclusion of others.
Absolutely. Portia Berry-Kilby, thank you very much indeed for your time this morning, Catholic journalist. Shall we reintroduce our panel? Annunziata Rees-Mogg, who's with us, the head of communications at Popular Conservatism, and we also have the former Labour advisor Matthew Torbett with us on this very significant day for the Catholic Church. Annunziata, you will have been celebrating Easter. You went to Mass.
Yes.
How much does Pope Francis come up in day-to-day discussions of the Church with your fellow Catholics?
I mean, I think he has undoubtedly been controversial, that he was extremely political. And it's a rather love it or hate it. I mean, ironically, as the Catholic here, politically, Matthew, the non-Catholic, supports the Pope's political views more than I do.
Probably, yeah.
But that was separate to his faith, and I think it is absolutely unquestionable that he showed not only through his words but also his actions that he was a genuinely holy, theological, faithful man who lived by what he believed and professed. And
Matthew, obviously you two have different politics and you have different faith perhaps as well, different perspectives on all these issues, but was it not demonstrated when J.D. Vance met with the Pope that the power of faith and our ability to connect with people regardless of politics is something that Pope Francis demonstrated time and time again?
Yeah, I think it transcends politics. I mean, as someone that doesn't really do religion, even I've been to the Vatican. You know, it's huge historical context there at the Vatican, and it wasn't fortunate enough to see him popping his little head out one Sunday. I was stuck in the crowds and whatever else. But it's a huge thing, and I think that's maybe what we turn to next after today. You know, who is going to be the next pope? What are their politics going to play a part? You know, I'm sure there's. It strikes me certainly as a similar to politics. There'll be hustling and jostling to see. There'll be runners and riders, no doubt. And what does that mean for the future of the Catholic Church itself?
Absolutely. And when he was made Pope, Francis said he was going to bring down all the little cliques within the cardinals in the Vatican. Some people had their apartments removed for being too power play behind the scenes. And we will have to wait to find out whether that has actually worked, because, of course, now the process is beginning to choose the next pope, and the cardinals will have to go through that process. I suspect conclave is about to rocket back up the charts for people to find out exactly what might or might not be going on behind the scenes until the Sistine Chapel chimney produces the white smoke that obviously famously our Foreign Secretary Lamy thought was crass and unnecessary racial innuendo. It's not. It confirms whether there's a new pope.
I didn't know this, that only cardinals under the age of 80 are eligible to vote. Typically around 120, and they're all locked in, aren't they, while they make this decision? Very intense. And how long does this process take, Annunziata, do you know?
There can be various rounds, as indeed there were when Francis was ultimately chosen. But it's a reasonably quick process. It will be a matter of weeks before we know who the next head of the church is.
And there's black smoke if no pope is elected, and white smoke to indicate, well, signal success, that a new pope has been found. But a candidate must receive 2/3 of the ballot, so that's why it can take a little amount of time.
Exactly.
But it doesn't have to be unanimous.
It doesn't. And like any election, they will be behind the scenes lobbying for support, except you're not allowed to have ambition, obviously. Right. So you can't lobby for yourself.
Matthew, obviously this is a moment of reflection, but also these periods when there's an empty chair and the Catholic Church is under additional scrutiny from around the world, additional focus, can be quite uncomfortable for them as well. This is an ancient institution, which in many ways is still catching up with the rest of the world, not necessarily just on issues of morality, but it's still grappling with an abuse crisis, which Pope Francis himself gave the full confidence to some people who perhaps didn't deliver the full role they should have in dealing with that throughout the many decades of that being an issue, in recent years in particular. That's going to be difficult for the Catholic Church, again, to have that back into focus.
I think so, but I suppose a bit like lots of old institutions, it's still going, and from what we understand is sort of thriving actually now and going through a period of resurgence, despite the world being very different from when, you know, the idea that religion began. So there will be an awkward period because obviously people look to their leaders, as I said earlier, for guidance, be that spiritual, political, moral, whatever else that might be. And again, it'll be interesting to see what sort of character, be more rather than the politics, the character that takes role of the next Pope, and how they wish to go about it. Will it diverge differently from how Pope Francis has gone about things in a more sort of colloquial, off-the-cuff sort of way and very open and tolerant, to a more sort of traditional way of what maybe lots of Catholics maybe were crying out for a little bit under Pope Francis? It's going to be very interesting.
Very interesting, because so many political leaders around the world take inspiration from the Pope, which can really change how global matters work. We're going to have to say goodbye for just now. Please stay in the studio. Matthew Torvet and Annunziata Rees-Mogg.
Thank you both. Well, let's cross now to GB News correspondent Matthew Walker, who's live from Westminster Cathedral, which held Cameron Walker, who's where there was a Latin Mass at 10:30 this morning, where priests officiating the service paid tributes to the late Pope. Cameron.
Yeah, they certainly were, Charlie, and we have actually had an update from the Vatican in the last 20 minutes or so, confirming that at 8 o'clock this evening, local time, so 7 o'clock here in London, that is when the Holy Roman Church will preside over the rite of the certification of the death of Pope Francis, and that is when his body will be placed inside the coffin. So just a little bit of an update from the Vatican there. Here in London, of course, I'm outside Westminster Cathedral, the focal point for Catholics here in the United Kingdom. And the flag of the Holy See has just been lowered to half-mast above the building. The Union flag, as far as I'm aware, is still at full mast, but the Holy See flag has now been lowered, a sign of respect for Pope Francis, who passed away 7:35 local time this morning. And of course, as we've been hearing all morning, tributes have been pouring in around the world, including from King Charles, who said he and the Queen were most deeply saddened to learn of the death of Pope Francis and were greatly moved to have been able to visit him earlier in the month. And Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer has also paid tribute, saying Pope Francis as a pope for the poor, the downtrodden and the forgotten, saying hope was at the heart of his papacy. Now, Pope Francis actually has already made his funeral plans public. Of course, his health was deteriorating for some time. He was in hospital for more than a month, suffering a double pneumonia when he was 21 years old a number of decades ago. He had part of his lung removed, actually, again, for pneumonia, 88 years old at the time of his death. But he's modified and simplified his funeral rites. He did that last year. We are still expecting a funeral mass to be held in St. Peter's Square, but unlike previous popes, Francis has been asked to be buried in Rome's St. Mary Major Basilica, to be near his favourite icon of the Madonna, or the Virgin Mary. He's also asked to be buried in a simple wooden casket, unlike, again, his predecessors, who are usually buried in 3 interlocking caskets made of cypress, lead and oak as well, perhaps reflecting the Pope's emphasis on supporting the poor, something he really did throughout his papacy, because, again, when he moved into the Vatican, he didn't choose the grand papal apartments which were available to him. Instead, he decided to live in a far more modest, smaller apartment within the Vatican City, and it's there which he received a number of world leaders in the last month or so. Most recently, it was the Vice President of the United States, Vadi Vance, as well as the King and Queen just a couple of weeks ago. Well, people have been gathering here outside Westminster Cathedral over the last few hours, paying their respects, and we spoke to a few of them a little bit earlier.
It was not any pope, it's our pope, it was our pope, and well, I think it's the best for him because he stopped feeling well, or he was very ill, so I think it's the best for him.
And how do you think his legacy will be remembered?
A pope that made lots of changes, and he was very brave, and well, he was a strong man with conviction.
It's certainly a very devastating news. He's the Holy Father, he's the head of the Church Universal, and I think all Catholic faithful in the world must be devastated hearing this news today. I think it might be too early to make a statement about his legacy now, but I'm quite confident his pontificate will be one of the most important pontificates in the modern history of the Church.
He was elected. I was also as a tourist here in London, and I came to this place when we saw that the smoke was white, and we all want to know who is the new Pope. So I'm very moved that today I hear that he's entered immortality.
We're expecting a mourning period of around 15 days for Pope Francis before conclave can begin to elect a new pope. Cardinals will be travelling to Rome as we speak before conclave happens in the Sistine Chapel. Under the age of 80 are the ones who are allowed to vote. But for today, we are paying tribute, and the world is paying tributes to Pope Francis, who has died at the age of 88.
Thank you, Cameron Walker, outside Westminster Cathedral. And we're joined now by our panel, Annunziata Rees-Mogg and Matthew Torbett. And Annunziata, Cameron is outside the home of Catholicism in England and Wales, and the priest there, Father Patrick van der Vos, said that every year when he spoke with Pope Francis, he would say the same thing. If you want to be good priests, just keep your eyes on Jesus. And he said, in a sense, that it's symbolic that he died on Easter Sunday, moving into Easter Monday, which is actually all about keeping our eyes on Christ.
Absolutely. As we enter the Eastertide, it is everything is about Christ. And the Old Testament, for example, gets dropped from the readings so that you can focus on Jesus' life over the next few weeks. And I think Jesus lived the life demonstrating the beliefs of the Church. And I think Pope Francis very much tried to do the same. The belief in the equality of all humans, that the poor man is as valuable, if not more valuable, than the wealthy. Those who are suffering, its lives are to be treasured and supported in our communities. And I think he lived that demonstrably.
And Matthew, we're just coming up to the end of the programme now. But Matthew, final word to you on this, really. A huge moment for the Catholic Church. A lot can change depending on who is Pope, who sits in that position. Your thoughts on the political reaction?
It probably shows the popularity of the man in the way that I said earlier. I think he transcended politics despite having his own political views, which were very well known and that he would speak about. I hope the next Pope carries on in fame regardless of his politics. OK, well, Matthew Talbot, thank you very much. And Annunziata Rees-Mogg. Now, Pope Francis, the head of the Catholic Church, the Bishop of Rome, has died. That is the news today.
March 2013, and Jorge Mario Bergoglio stood on the balcony of St. Peter's in Rome and said a simple Buonasera.
Fratelli e sorelle, grazie tante dell'accoglienza.
It was the start of a very different pontificate from his predecessor Benedict, who'd retired from his onerous duties. The former Archbishop of Buenos Aires was the first pope to take the name of Francis, the saint of the poor and of nature. He was, though, to usher in a time of richer relations with his worldwide congregation, both in style and substance. And that soon became evident as he made his presence in the Vatican more accessible. Gone were the grand papal apartments. He moved to the Casa Santa Marta to live simply with others. When he visited the headquarters of the EU, he did so in a battered car, and a more informal approach echoed the approach of John Paul II. The carnival is over, he declared, referring to the Vatican's cliques and factions. There was instead a whirling circus of high-profile media appearances. The Pope wanted to be part of the modern world. He was clearly spontaneous and open. When asked about homosexuality, he answered, "Who am I to judge?" But did indeed pass judgment publicly on those who had been abused.
Faccio un sentito appello